Is it up and running?
In spite of it all, we're all here.
In spite of it all, we all made it. Yes, a little bit late, thanks to the traffic snafus, but we're here, and that's what's important. It's our ancestors traveled through wilderness, we travel through traffic, and we all get the Torah eventually. But what do you do once you've got Torah? That's part of what the entirety of the book of Deuteronomy is about, and it's going to be a big part of our discussion today. That is, our ancestors had Torah. They got Torah in the wilderness. Moses is about to hand them off to Joshua, and he is giving them these final series of talks and reminders about what to do or what not to do. But there's a big question that comes in, which is, but Torah was finite. Right? The Torah was not in a 3-ring binder, which means we don't get to easily add new pages to the Torah. So what happens later? What happens now the Torah is finito? What do we do?
Discuss it.
We what? We use it. We discuss it. Exactly right. We use it by discussing it to make sure we're using it correctly. And does that mean then that there is no external input? Is there no way to get an updated version?
The Talmud, the Mishnah, what have you.
We have the Talmud and Mishnah, which is a record of the discussions, debates, and decisions, the commentaries, exactly. So it's very, very interesting that when you speak with Jewish groups, that everyone answers very clearly, well, you take the Torah, you read it, you look at the commentaries, you look at what Mishnah and Talmud has said, you find out what the halacha has been, and you apply it in new ways to new situations, and you keep moving. And that's Torah. Nobody here once said, find a holy person that can talk to God and find the answer. None of you said, find a prophet.
The age of
Well, that's
prophecy
not
was
what we
over.
do in our generation.
That's not what we do in our generation. But there were times when prophets were around. And in this section of the Torah, in Parashat Re'eh, Moses is very, very careful to give guidelines for what prophecy will look like after him. And that's going to be really important. So let's read a little Torah, we'll talk a little bit, and then we'll look at our commentaries. What's that? Poor Moses. Well, he had a good run, 120 years, 3 different careers, and I think he was a success in all of them. So most people can't quite say the same. Page 1068, we're going to be in chapter 13 of Devarim, chapter 13 of Deuteronomy. Everyone got that? Chapter 13, page 1068. It's near the bottom of the page. And I'm looking for a volunteer. Marion?
Sons and daughters.
Oh, the one line right below that, where the little
Oh, be
one is
careful.
hovering. Be careful.
Be careful to observe only that which I enjoin upon you, neither add to it or take away from it.
All right, so that's the general statement that has become a very, very important principle in Judaism, which is you don't add and you don't subtract from Torah. Right? It's a closed book. We don't get the whiteout if we want to amend something. We don't get to add in new commandments to the Torah that we think would be helpful. You know, the all traffic lights must be properly synchronized commandments. You know, thou shalt not use your phone while waiting for the red light. You know, we don't get to add those into the Torah. We can add them as part of our own societal and community regulations, but we don't get to call them Torah. We don't get to say they came from the Torah. Don't add, don't delete. Okay, onward.
If there appears among you a prophet, or a dream diviner, and he gives you a sign or a code saying,
All right, pause there. So if there appears among you a prophet, well, it's not really so much of an if in Moses' day. Moses knows there will be prophets that come later. And so how to regulate the appearance of these prophets, how to regulate our reaction to the appearance of a prophet is very, very important. Because we just said don't add and don't take away. But we're going to have people who appear, many legitimately, that do have a connection, an insight to God, that are going to say things. How do we respond to what they say? And how do we tell the legitimate ones from the illegitimate ones. Everyone got the topic? Onward.
Let us follow and worship another God, whom you have not experienced, even if the sign or portent that he named to you comes true. Do not heed the words of that prophet or that dream divine. For the Lord your God is testing you to see whether you really love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. Follow none but the Lord your God and revere none but him. Observe his commandments alone and eat only his orders. Worship none but him and hold fast to him.
All right. So, what's the big test for a prophet? How do we know immediately a prophet is illegitimate?
He talks of other gods.
He talks about other gods. Right? God will never send a prophet that will talk about other gods. But there's a big even if that's implied in here.
Even if the predictions he makes come true.
Even if he does signs and wonders. Among them might be predictions, or they might be signs and wonders similar to turning water into to blood, like Moses did, or producing the scaly afflictions on the arm that's called Sira'at, or any of the other things that prophets might do, or just really clever people might be able to accomplish. No matter what signs and wonders are given, no matter what predictions come true, as soon as that guy says, and that means we should worship, insert name of foreign god there, it's out of bounds. That raises a little bit of a question though, doesn't it? The even if part. No one's bothered by the fact.
And what if he doesn't perform any wonders?
What if he doesn't perform any wonders or miracles or make predictions? Then he's not considered a prophet. He's just considered a plain old idolater. and those we've got dime a dozen. But Moses was not concerned in this chapter, concerned elsewhere, wasn't concerned in this chapter about us being seduced by just our neighbors, or in this paragraph I should say. He was actually worried about our neighbors in a minute, but he wasn't concerned about our neighbors in this paragraph confusing us and dragging us towards idolatry. He was worried about someone who did something so impressive that we would say he must be sent by God.
Well, Pharaoh's people did the same thing Moses did beyond the killing of the firstborn.
We
So there was an example right there. Yeah, Moses said God is doing this, but hey, these guys can do the same thing.
They did the whole blood to wine thing, and blood to wine. They did the whole water to blood thing, and other wonders as well within the early.
To a snake and all of this.
Exactly right. So it seems that there is the ability for people to appear to have either special knowledge and make predictions, or have special powers and perform signs or wonders. That might be very, very convincing, and might, even depending upon how you read this, suggest that God was behind it. That God gave them the ability to do that in order to test us. Would we still say no to idolatry no matter how good the stage show was? No matter how impressive the prediction was? And if someone came to you and said, here are the lottery numbers for the next 3 weeks, and the first week they were right, and the second week they were right, and the third week, now that you've bet your mortgage, they were right, and then they said, and just make a sacrifice to such and such, and you'll get the next week's lottery numbers. Wouldn't that be a lot more compelling than someone who just said, sacrifice to such and such and I'll be your friend?
Some of us are very gullible.
Well, I'm not talking about gullibility, I'm talking about real. If you've got 3 weeks of lottery numbers in a row,
The chances are you might possibly be swayed.
right, I mean, that's not gullible to think this person has something going for them. I mean, even if it might be corruption, but what's that?
Inner knowledge.
Something going on here. And what is being argued is that even if you see signs and wonders that completely astound you and convince you that this person has some power of some type that you lack, you don't follow them if what they tell you to do is idolatrous.
course, we all know there have been all of these experiments and things about paranormal or whatever you
Mhm.
call them experiences, where some people seem to have some sort of psychic advantage that others don't have. Do we not also have, as part of our Judaic have to seek for truth and look for something beyond what we know? But it has nothing to do with idolatry or attributing to a god.
Correct.
Are we still forbidden to pursue an investigation of that sort of prediction, if you will?
Investigating natural phenomena that are presented under the phrase psychic is certainly permissible. Investigating them as part of a idolatrous religious practice is where it becomes a problem. So if someone says, I can predict, what the weather is going to be next year, and they say they can do it because they have psychic abilities, you can investigate what possible natural mechanics would create such knowledge and awareness and see whether or not it's right. The same way that we would also test the meteorologist's ability to figure out what the weather's going to be next year by measurement of what tools they're using. So it's not saying that there can't be predictions and abilities that are different than most of us have, but they are saying they would be within the natural order. They would not belong to the power of some idol.
Right, so we're forbidden voodoo, but we can say, okay, Duke University wants to look into some people being able to predict the next 40 cards or something. That's okay.
Absolutely, and if they want to get out the functional magnetic resonance imaging scans and see what's happening in their brain while they're making their predictions, if you want to get out sensitive equipments to measure for electromagnetic fields and all sorts of other things for somebody who thinks they can move pencils with their brain, no problem. But as soon as you say, oh, but I need a shrine to such and such God, then we're crossing a line.
Okay.
Right.
Accept that.
Well, and it's important to realize that in the ancient world, someone might have had the ability to predict when the rains are going to come, because they actually did track those sorts of things based upon the stars. The stars are a calendar, and so they could make very accurate predictions of when the Nile would flood and things like that, and when an eclipse will come. They got pretty good at predicting those kinds of things. The average person wouldn't have been able to make that prediction for themselves, but the wise person, the priest, might have been able to. Would you have been convinced, and tomorrow the sun will darken in the wrath of my God, blah, 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 and the sun darkens? Okay, well, I guess his God must be... No, Torah says you don't. Because as soon as he finishes it off with God such and such, of some other, idolatrous deity, we've got trouble. Onward?
As for that prophet or dream diviner, he shall be put to death, for he urged disloyalty to the Lord your God, who freed you from the land of Egypt, and who redeemed you from the house of bondage, to make you stray from the path which the Lord your God commanded you to follow. Thus you will sweep out evil from your midst.
So, what's so bad about someone just making prophecies and doing wonders especially if they're true, and even if they came from God? I mean, God testing us. Well, death penalty?
We're still commanded not to worship idols.
Okay, so shouldn't we just tell the guy to quit it? Why execute?
Because he's trying to convince other people to worship idols.
Because he's using this as a means of coercion. As you say, there are lots of gullible people. There are lots of not gullible people, but people that can be persuaded by real events. And if we're open to that kind of persuasion to the point of rejecting Torah, then those types of persuasions need to be removed. Need to be removed. And we're going to get an even harsher version of that in our next paragraph.
If your brother, your own mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife of your bosom, or your closest friend entices you in secret, saying, come, let us worship other gods.
All right, look at that first sentence, right? Your brother, your own mother's son, your son or daughter, the wife of your bosom, your closest friend. It actually means the friend of that is like your soul. Is the literal Hebrew, which I think is a bit stronger than closest friend. I mean, these kinds of adjectives don't show up all the time in Torah. What do you think Torah is trying to say here?
Nobody's exempt.
Nobody's exempt. Thank you. Right? It doesn't matter how much you love the person. It doesn't matter how dear the person is to you. If what we are about to talk about happens, you must respond accordingly. And what comes next, Miriam?
Come, let us worship other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have experienced, from among the gods of the peoples around you, either near to you or distant, anywhere from one end of the earth to the other. Do not assent or give heed to him. Show him no pity or compassion, and do not shield him, but take his life. Let your hand be the first against him, to put him to death, and the hand of the rest of the people thereafter.
All right, and the rest continues in a similar vein. Eventually we end up with an entire town that can be subject to execution if they continue in this way. And of course, all of these things do require investigation, proper courts, and testimony, and everything else. Just make sure we understand that. That's always implied in the Torah as implied by other parts of the Torah. So we're not talking about if someone comes up to you and says, hey, do you want to worship such and such? You don't get to turn around and kill them. You would take them to court where it could be proved that this was what they had been promoting and doing, and then if everything was done according to proper procedure, then and only then would execution take place, and you would be part of the execution squad, even though it was your closest and dearest person. That's a pretty high standard, isn't it? A pretty high price to pay. I mean, I'm sure that most of us would feel terrible about turning in a loved one for committing a crime. And I'm sure most of us would feel horrific if we thought we had to turn them in for a crime for which the punishment was capital punishment. Isn't this asking too much? I mean, what's so bad about idols?
From a modern point of view, it doesn't seem to be the Jewish thing to do, but looking at our present history, it seems in fact that we have other faiths that seem to consider that if you are a heretic to their faith, or not a believer, that you're fair game for execution, as we see Christians being persecuted, Jews of course being persecuted by those who practice other faiths. So, but to say, hey, if you sincerely believe in something or other and are becoming evangelical for that, you need to be murdered. In modern terms, doesn't seem to be the Jewish thing to do.
But notice that there's an important distinction between what you said and what the Torah said. If someone was to come and proselytize for a monotheistic faith to a Jewish person, and without idols, without anything else, does this say they get executed? No. It's only when someone comes to promote idolatry. And that, at least to me, says that there's something about idolatry which is different. Because Judaism understands that the different peoples of the world can have different faiths and can have a different path to God. What Judaism won't tolerate, and yes, it is intolerant in this respect, is functional idolatry. But what is it about idolatry that makes it so bad? It's not just that Judaism hates other faiths. Judaism doesn't hate other faiths, as long as they are righteous and seeking justice and peace and seeking God without idols and all those other trappings. Live and let live is exactly what Judaism preaches and teaches and has practiced.
Because idolatry is inimical to Jewish life, to the concept of monotheism, the concept of
One God.
And absolute morality. The idea of idolatry is to roll your own religion. I mean, whatever you want to do in your religion, murder, rape, whatever you want to do, you can carve an idol to support it. And so it turns it on its head. This idolatry is man-made.
Right. We make the gods in idolatry.
God makes us in our.
Rather than God making us.
So it's totally compatible with the concept of monotheism. Our faith.
And let's take that idea then, the idea of control, of who's in control, of what's in control, and how that works out. And in particular, I want to just go back mentally to our discussion about prophecy, and let's take a look at some texts.
I'd like to ask something
Please.
here before we move on. I've been troubled, and I still am, about how we will justify, we will compromise, and we'll say, thank you, that, well, Allah is God.
Mhm.
Please don't tell me you agree with that.
Well, so the word Allah is the Arabic word for God. I mean, that is what that word means. It comes from the same root as the word El within Hebrew.
Right.
So the same way that
The God that is represented by that name Allah
Mhm.
doesn't look anything like our God. There's
it depends on who's doing the representation. I have to say that. The same way that there are people, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, who use the name of our God in ways that I do not believe are faithful and honest to our traditions or faithful and honest to God. There are many that use the name Allah in ways that are horrific and, I'm sure, make God cringe. But there are many who do worship God through the name Allah and through the structures of Islam that can live peacefully and honorably and with justice and goodness. And the name itself is not the problem. It's what people have done in that name that have been the problem. The same way that during the Middle Ages, when the Crusaders and others would use the names of the Christian faith, I don't believe that they were representing the Christian faith well. And that doesn't mean that I would not still hold the names that Christianity uses as being illegitimate names for God. Because I know many Christians who serve God in those names in ways that are honorable, just, righteous, and peaceful. And I believe that in the potential for the vast majority of Muslims to serve God through their faith in ways that are good and peaceful. And I'm hoping that they will continue to outnumber and eventually overthrow those who seek to serve God through that name only in violence. So it's not the name that's the problem, it's what people have done in the name, which in a very good way brings us to our first text. So what we have here is a text from Zephaniah, one of the Hebrew prophets, and there are many people who point to this in our current context. So Miriam, would you like to read for us?
For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon desolate. They shall drive out Ashdod at noonday, and Ekron shall be uprooted. Woe to the inhabitants of the seacoast, the nation of Seraphites.
Don't worry about it.
The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. I will destroy you, so there shall be no inhabitant.
All right, so in this part of his prophecy, Zephaniah is saying that this coastal area, which was primarily non-Jewish, it wasn't run certainly by Judea, is going to, at some point in his future, the prophet's future, experience this calamity. And so there have been people now, Jewish commentators, that say, see, right? What do we see? Gaza shall be forsaken, it shall be desolate. Of course, Ashdod and Ashkelon are currently part of Israel, but that doesn't matter, that they focus on the Gaza word, and they focus on the idea of, I will destroy you so there shall be no inhabitant, and therefore they say our policy must be.
Destroy Gaza.
Right, the prophecy makes it true. So, yes, Zephaniah prophesies the Jewish state eradicating and destroying the entire inhabited area of Gaza. Therefore, roll up your sleeves and get to work, right? No? Everyone seems to be a little bit shy about jumping on that bandwagon.
Prophecy is a prediction of what will come. It's not a direction that you should do it.
You can be, although most of Jewish prophecy, when aimed at the people, was meant to be convincing us to change our ways. You know, the prophecy we read for Yom Kippur is all about changing our moral behavior.
Okay.
Even though, unfortunately, Isaiah was wrong and we ended up not changing our moral behavior before catastrophe befell that generation. So much of Jewish prophecy is entirely about prescription, not merely description. So, So the modern prophets that are saying we have come to the point where we should enact what Zephaniah was saying, no one seems to be eager to join in or to say that this is absolutely incontrovertibly dealing with our time, and we clearly understand that this means wholesale slaughter. No?
No,
Getting a lot.
how would we know whether it was supposed to apply to our time?
Well, a prophet said it.
Yeah, when did he say it? A couple of thousand years ago?
Yeah, a couple thousand years ago.
Why did it take so long?
Why did it take so long?
Wow. There was the prophecy for the Messiah, but that hasn't happened yet. Are you saying that's not a true prophecy then?
How will we know if it is true if it does come?
But the distinction there will be, will we know it's true when it comes, not what can I do to make it come. So the difficulty with the prophecies, in particular, Michael, the prescription types, the description, is that people have often felt that they knew when it was happening. And so the question of prophecy and the questions of signs and wonders becomes even slipperier than it looked when we read through our section of Deuteronomy, because we can even have a legitimate prophecy, a legitimate prophet. Zephaniah is part of our tradition, whose prophecies can be nevertheless interpreted in many different varieties and many different ages, and used to support preconceived notions by various factions of what they think should be doing. Everyone follow that? Right, just because we have a prophecy doesn't mean we understand the prophecy well enough that we can use the prophecy. And as a matter of fact, this particular prophecy is that God will take care of this, which would already leave us wondering whether or not we are supposed to. And the fact that Ashkelon and Ashdod are not part of the coastal communities of our enemies at the moment would also imply that this is perhaps not applicable to our current day. And most likely this is dealing with the metaphor of who were the enemies in the time of Zephaniah, and trying to give solace and comfort and hope to the people of his generation, that even those people who seem to be an insurmountable foe, God will eventually one day overthrow. And it doesn't have to be exactly those people for the ultimate prophecy to come true at the end of days. That makes sense? It wouldn't do much good for Zephaniah to use the word Hamas to describe it. And you may not even be talking about Hamas, you might be talking about whole different groups of people that we have not even met yet in terms of eventual cultural development that will be in the time of the Mashiach that we will be fighting. But he has to use terms that would have been understood by the people of his own day. Make sense?
What about the part where after Sodom and Gomorrah and after the flood that God said, I'm not going to do this anymore?
Well, he never said that about Sodom and Gomorrah. What he said was after the flood is, I won't destroy the world. God never said he would never intervene in case-by-case basis.
I didn't read the line.
Yeah. So our guarantee only extends to 100% destruction. Destruction short of 100% was not promised. That is to say, it's still possible. And we get acts of destructions against the Egyptians. In addition to the Sodom and Gomorrah scenes, we get acts of destructions against other foes of the people of Israel as well. So it's certainly on the cards, or on the table, I should say. The military option is still on the table as far as God is concerned. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what this is talking about, or that's what this is going to be happening. I mean, for all we know, this prophecy could have been talking about a self-destructive behavior of some community of people, and that they would indeed be wiped out by their own hand, their own actions.
We have to remember that God's clock isn't the same as ours.
Yeah, God's got a much bigger clock. And what seems like waiting forever for us, doesn't count as waiting at all for God. Very true. All right, so we're going to get one more example from our texts about prophecy, about how confusing this can be. And Marion, you were reading.
I continue. Therefore, hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne with all the host of heaven standing around him on his right and on his left. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab into attacking Ramoth Gilead and going to his death there.
All right, so let's make sure we got the scene here. So we're during the time of Ahab, one of the worst kings of the northern tribes of Israel. And the prophet, this is a real prophet, is recounting that he saw an image, a vision of God in a throne room. And that God was saying, I want Ahab dead. And the way I want him dead is I want him to go attack Ramoth Gilead, the heights of Gilead, which he will die when he does. So how can I get him there to then have him be wiped out? That's the committee discussion. That's what's in God's agenda. He wants Ahab there so Ahab can get killed. How's he going to do it? Keep reading.
One suggests this and another that.
Like most committees, there were lots of opinions.
Finally, a spirit came forward, stood before the Lord, and said, I will entice him. By what means, the Lord asked. I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouths of all his prophets, he said. You will succeed in enticing him, said the Lord. Go and do it. So now the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouths of all these prophets of yours. The Lord has decreed disaster for you.
So Micaiah is telling Ahab and his crew, his court, you want to know why all your prophets say, go attack, it'll be okay, you'll win? Because God's just trying to lure you to your death. They're only prophesying because God has empowered a spirit of prophecy to come and convince your false prophets to say this because it will truly do what God wants, which is no good for you. Because you'll end up dead. Which means you shouldn't go. You shouldn't do it. You should understand that even though you think you have the clear sign of what to do, you're going to end up dead if you follow it. Ahab dies. But that's because people like hearing that they're going to win more than they're going to lose. And Ahab had lots of history already. And that's why God was right when he said it'll work, because he knew Ahab pretty well. But what about now? Well,
When the latter prophets died, that is, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, then the Holy Spirit came to an end in Israel.
right, now when we say Holy Spirit, when we say Ruach HaKodesh, we're not talking about Holy Spirit in a Christological sense. We're talking about the spirit of prophecy. Which means that after these last three of the prophets passed away, there are no prophets in Israel. And anyone who claims to be a prophet is prima facie wrong. According to Judaism, as I think someone mentioned, I can't remember who, we no longer live in the age of prophecy. We live in the age of debate, discussion, and argument, which has its ups and downs. But we don't have prophets. But that didn't stop our sages from still discussing what would happen if and when prophecy resumed, which is what our next text is going to bring us to.
Rav Abahu said in Rabbi Yohanan's name, with every matter if the prophet tells you to transgress the commands of the Torah, obey him with the exception of idolatry. Should he even cause the sun to stand still in the middle of the heavens for you, do not obey him.
All right. What did he say? Prophet.
You should obey.
A prophet comes and tells me, break Shabbat. What should I do?
You should do it.
I should break Shabbat.
That's what it said.
Prophet comes and tells me to have adultery. What should I do?
It's a bad prophet.
It's a bad prophet, I agree, but you should commit adultery, apparently. Prophet comes and says, murder that guy. Apparently you're supposed to murder him. A prophet comes to you and says, bow down to this idol.
No.
I mean, really? Really? I can murder, violate Shabbat, break, commit adultery, but bowing to an idol, that you shouldn't do. Now, first of all, we have to remember that the prophet that's being discussed here is one that has been verified. That is to say, it's a prophet that has made predictions, done signs and wonders that were revealed to be true and correct. So it's not just anyone who shows up and has a little name badge that says, hello, my name is prophet. They don't get to tell you all these things. It's got to be someone that has been tested and verified as being a true prophet. And yet, even if they tell you to break all these commandments, according to Rabbi Yochanan, you should do them, except for the commandment of idolatry. Again, come back to that question from the very beginning of our discussion. Is idolatry really so bad, so much worse than all these other things? What's that?
Very troublesome statement.
Very troublesome.
Very troublesome.
Let's read the next paragraph.
It has been taught. Rabbi Jose
Galilean. Galilean.
Galilean said Torah understood the extreme depths of depravity inherited in idolatry. Therefore, the Torah gave him power. That should he even cause the sun to stand still in the middle of the heavens, we must not heed him.
All right, so because we're going back to that question that was kind of glossed over, which is, why would the sun obey him? Right? It says, even if they make the sun stand still, you still shouldn't follow him to idolatry. Well, why would the sun stand still? Is that the kind of thing that non-legitimate prophets should be able to do? And the answer that he's giving is, no, God made the sun stand still to test you, to see whether you would be convinced by the sun more than you would be convinced by Torah. That if you would be convinced by the natural phenomenon, by the miracle this guy is supposedly performing, or apparently is actually performing with God's assistance, whether that would be enough to persuade you and move you towards idolatry. So we're all happy with God performing miracles on behalf of idolatrous prophets? No. No. We're not happy, and Rabbi Akiva wasn't happy either.
Rabbi Akiva said, God forbid that the Almighty should cause the sun to stand still at the request of those who transgressed his will. But the Torah refers to one as Hananiah, the son of Azur, who was originally a true prophet and only subsequently became a false prophet.
Right, so, subsequently. So Rabbi Akiva gives us a different scenario that makes this a little bit more palatable, which is, once upon a time there was a real prophet. And this was a true prophet who performed true miracles with the help of God and who was true in speaking God's word. And everyone knew that this was a true God. It was widely known. He made the sun stand still, for crying out loud. Everyone knows he's a real prophet. And listen to what he's telling us. It's all good stuff. It's all Torah. And then the guy changes and is no longer working on the right side. Well, when he tells you to go worship the idol, you're going to say, well, I don't know. I mean, maybe we should worship the idol. After all, last week, he made the sun stand still. And the answer is no. Just because someone did it in the past doesn't mean that what they're promoting now is legitimate, if it fails to pass this test. Make sense? Maybe? A little bit?
Yes.
Okay.
Aren't we constantly being tested by God?
Are we constantly being tested by God? In what way? Are you saying there's a quiz today?
Well, in the cases where, not in the sense of idolatry, but where we have to make, as individuals, we're faced with making choices throughout our lives.
Right. So we are constantly being tested by the world that God created, which is slightly different than saying God is constantly testing us. And it's an important step in perhaps reconciling some of these words with some of our own feelings. To say God is testing you, most of us would imply it's the equivalent of the teacher is testing you, right? The teacher handed out the test and is going to grade you based upon your performance. To say that the world that God created is testing us is to say that the world was created in such a way that disbelief or false belief is possible. God did not hardwire us to reject idolatry. It's not part of our brain chemistry. We have the capacity to worship idols. It would be a lot easier, I think, if we didn't have that capacity, if it was just impossible. The same way that we can't see ultraviolet light, we couldn't see idols. That would be a very handy change in our brain chemistry. But it's not. That means we will constantly face experiences which will lead us towards considering idolatry. How we respond to those circumstances is the test. That doesn't mean that God is deliberately trapping you in a room with an idol and saying, let's see what he does. You know, the way you might put a rat in a maze. But if you encounter these things, you can be sure there's a right answer. And you can be sure you'll get a much better grade if you give the right answer, which is, I don't want no idols.
He gave us the cheat sheet right here.
He gave us the cheat sheet, exactly right. And that's ultimately what idolatry destroys, is it destroys the cheat sheet. Idolatry, as Michael was saying, is man's attempt to create his own set of rules to play by. It's his own attempt to throw out the rule book, the Torah, and write it again to fit whatever he or she feels like at the moment. And to have a little statue that symbolizes that and that can be controlled and manipulated in some ways. And that's possible. It's physically possible to do. And it's even physically possible to think you're getting benefits from these things. Right? When the pagans would burn giant bonfires in the middle of the summer solstice in order to bring back the sun from its darkness, what happened? The sun came back. It worked. Right? When they would offer sacrifices in order to have a good harvest, if they were still around by the next year, guess what happened with the previous harvest? It must have been good enough, because otherwise they would have starved to death. So idolatry can work, or at least look like it's working. God allows that to happen. We're going to talk a little bit more about why. But ultimately, idolatry is the rejection of the notion of Torah, the very idea that there are rules, that there are things we should and shouldn't do, and we don't get to just make it up. We still have to interpret, we still have to study, we still have to apply, but we don't get to just do what we want, which is why a false prophet for idolatry is an especially poisonous circumstance. Because they're not just saying, right now, murder is okay, or right now, breaking Shabbat is okay. They're saying, you don't even have to remember what Shabbat was. You don't even have to remember that murder was ever against the rules. Because the whole Torah is being pushed aside, and a statue is being put in its place, and I'll tell you what the statue wants. You don't get to read it for yourself. That's a problem. Trust me. Right? How many people here would be happy if we did this whole class without you having a copy of the Torah in front of you? Right? Or if I didn't actually bring texts from our past, but said, oh, no, the rabbi said this. No citations, no quotes, no way for you to ever check, verify, whatever. Yes? Happy?
Wouldn't work in our society.
Wouldn't work so well. Well, it wouldn't work so well in our community. I have to narrow that down a little bit. Yeah, in our society it does happen all the time. We accept sources of information with very little credential checking in many, many circumstances. And we just assume or believe that the source of information must be true. Torah is the opposite of that belief. I know it's still a belief, and I know that people would, religion is telling me that I shouldn't just rely on authority. It's like, no. Religion relies on authority that is continually reinforced and continually checked by the interaction with the community and itself.
But even Torah is open to review and
Debate, discussion, and interpretation. Yes. Not adding, not taking away, but definitely understanding continues to change as it needs to be applied in different sets of circumstances. So throughout our history, you might have one community in 100 CE doing Shabbat one way, and then you might have another community in 1500 CE doing Shabbat differently. But they'll both be Shabbat, and they'll both be connected to Torah, and they both will be legitimate expressions as needed by their communities if they followed this process that we've been talking about of debate, discussion, and argument and all of that. Whereas if one guy just comes up and says, no, you don't need to read the Torah anymore, I'll tell you what we should do on Shabbat. Judaism has a big problem with that. And that's what we call idolatry.
We still have our rabbinic councils and our bet ins, so we do have some sort of consortium that will discuss and decide whether it's this for modern times.
Correct.
So there is still a hierarchy who
Hierarchy-ish,
establishes
yes. It's not exactly an appellate process, because it's hard to get one rabbi to outrank another one. We kind of like round tables more than steps. But even in the absence of that, even in the absence of other rabbis and scholars that can be a counterbalance towards one wacko, the community has always been that counterbalance. If one rabbi began to preach and say, God came to me in a dream last night and says that we all need to start wearing pink, the community could say, well, Rabbi, that doesn't sound, like something that we've ever heard before. They wouldn't just say, yes, sir. They would question. Now, if he starts saying something like, I think we should wear pink and I think we should rob banks, then the community has the right to say, we don't want you as our rabbi anymore.
Peace will certainly find us in a minute.
So there has always been a communal check on the rabbinic authority, which is grounded in knowledge of text and grounded within the ability to question, based upon reason and logic and precedent, the decisions that are being made. That's why it's important that the community studies, not just the community leaders. Everyone is responsible for having that check be there. All right, we're going to actually skip the next thing. It's from Robert Alter, great teacher on the text of the Torah. You can go ahead and read it to your own time. He talks a little bit about Ibn Ezra, but I want to make sure that we can finish reasonably close on time. And the next text from the Talmud is more important. No offense to Robert Alter.
Hence we learn, those who follow idolatry deny as it were their adhesion to the whole Torah, and those who reject idolatry follow as it were the whole Torah.
Right. So I was just saying a second ago, but I brought support. Idolatry is the opposite of Torah. And Torah is the opposite of idolatry. If you believe in Torah, right, and you reject idolatry, then it's like you've done everything in the Torah. You've already done everything. And if you accept idolatry, but you still do all the other commandments, it's like you've not done anything at all in terms of the other commandments. Right? Someone who keeps Shabbos, keeps kosher, is honest in their business practice, and never murders anyone, never commits adultery, and does all the prayers at the right time and everything else, but they've got a statue of Zeus that they bow down to and they have their sacrifices to, all that other stuff doesn't count. All that other stuff doesn't count. Why not? I mean, shouldn't idolatry just be one more commandment? I mean, if someone does all that other stuff and they like to smoke on Shabbat, we would say, yes, they violated the commandment of not lighting fire on Shabbat, but all the other mitzvot still count. But idolatry uproots the entire thing? What's that? According to God, according to our sages, and partly that's because of our next phrase.
Rabbi Yohanan said that Gentiles outside the land of Israel are not idolaters, but simply observe their ancestral customs.
Right? So what is Rabbi Yochanan saying here? Is that people who live outside of Israel, yeah, they light fires to bring back the sun. And yeah, they offer up a sheep to have a good harvest. But they're not really idolaters. Even if they have statues, even if they have shrines, they're not really idolaters. They're just doing what they were taught. Right? Their grandparents used to light fires, and their great-grandparents used to light fires, and so they light fires. But they don't actually believe in idolatry in the way that is necessary to be called a true idolater. They're just doing what they were shown. It's customs. In the same way that someone who had a statue of Zeus but observed all the other commandments, all those other commandments then are being done as customs. And that's why they don't count. If you just fulfill all the commandments because that's what your grandfather did, but you go and worship a statue, you have stripped the meaning out of all of those mitzvot.
So idolatry only exists within the boundaries of the land of Israel?
According to Rabbi Yochanan, yes. Only potentially within at least his generation could exist within those boundaries. Because it was only there that there was a nexus of choice between following God and following idols knowingly with your eyes wide open, rather than simply repeating the customs of your ancestors.
So had they known about Hindus, it would have been a problem.
it seems to be from Rabbi Yochanan's perspective. I don't want to speak too expansively because he doesn't say too much, but it's more of an issue of how open are these people to what they are doing and what the spiritual underpinnings of it are. And we're going to talk about those spiritual underpinnings in just a minute. But that was what Rabbi Yochanan was arguing about. He was saying in Israel people should know better. In Israel, people should know what God is, and people should understand what the choice is and understand what idolatry means. That they are choosing the statue over God. But outside of it, it's their festival. You know, it's like when Halloween, most people here, right? If you celebrated Halloween, you did not celebrate it as a religious holiday. If you celebrated Valentine's Day, you did not celebrate it as a religious holiday. You're celebrating because it's a custom. It's just, what people have done. And the religious meaning was stripped out. That's what Rabbi Yochanan is referring to. And he's saying pagans around the world do all these things without having a true spiritual connection to what is implied by what they are doing. And if they did, they wouldn't do it. Just Israel. We have a tendency to still like it. Is his argument. Okay. Onward.
In Rome, they asked if God has no desire for idolatry, why doesn't he destroy it?
Right? I mean, like I said, hardwire our brain so we can't see idols. Or just someone builds a statue of a god and bows down to it, lightning bolt gone. Why aren't these things constantly being disintegrated?
If it was something unnecessary to the world that was worshipped, he would. But people worship the sun, moon, stars, and planets. Should he destroy his universe on account of fools?
Right? People worship trees. Does that mean God needs to destroy all the trees? People worship the moon. Does that mean God needs to destroy the moon because it's an idol? People worship the sun. Does God need to destroy the sun to make it because it's an idol? Which means God would have to destroy it. In order to get rid of the foolishness of idolatry, God would have to destroy the entire universe. Because people would worship something. But the rebuttal from the Romans?
The Romans said, if so, he should destroy what is unnecessary to the world and leave what is necessary.
Okay, fine. Don't blow up the sun, the moon, the planets, and the stars and the trees. But the statues of Zeus could still be zapped.
They replied, that would merely be strengthening the hands of the worshippers of these, because they would say, know that these are gods, behold, they have not been destroyed.
My worship of the sun must be legitimate, because God blew up the statue of Zeus, but he didn't blow up the sun. Therefore, the sun must be real. That's probably the real God, because all the other false gods got blown up. Like the way the human mind works? And we would justify it to ourselves. Very, very quickly. We would say if all the idols in the world disappeared overnight, all the naturalists in the world who worship mountains and rivers and trees would say, see, we told you statues weren't necessary to worship. They wouldn't say it was the one and only God. It would only reinforce those who had idolatrous forms of worship for the natural world. So God's hands are tied. Which means we're left with, why idolatry in the first place? Why couldn't we get away from this? Remember, this is part of a much longer discussion in Rambam's commentary, where he starts off with Adam and Eve and says, look, Adam and Eve, they knew God a little too well. And the people who came after Adam and Eve knew God. Cain and Abel, again, didn't work out so well, but they knew God. So where along the lines did people start talking to statues and trees? How did this happen? And he goes through a whole progression of how people invented intermediary stages and turned to them rather than to God alone in the forms of their worship. But then he adds in a very important element in this paragraph.
In times past, these beliefs were used to unify nations, fooling the general masses. They were told that the welfare of their land depended on these idols, and they should therefore gather into their temples, showing respect to the elders, teaching their secrets. The government was thus maintained stable.
Right? So Rambam, 1,000 years ago, could see that idolatry, because it was in the control of humans, rather than humans being controlled by God, rather than a king subservient to Torah, the idols become subservient to the king. That idolatry, which was a innocent mistake of naive, primitive people became enshrined as a political tool of the state for controlling the masses. Because it was something that was fundamentally unknowable by the average person, because it wasn't real, and therefore could be used to manipulate the masses by the leaders. The elders could come out, they could perform their signs and wonders, and they could tell people anything they felt like. And the people, thinking it was necessary for the goodness of their state and their lives, what choice but they have but to obey? And that made people nice and stable. Make sense?
Yeah, it served a purpose.
It served a purpose of control. Again, idolatry is the antithesis of Torah because it puts the control in the hands of the person who is telling you what they think the idol has said, and sorry, you couldn't hear that. And Torah puts the control within the individual person, not to make it up as they want, but to follow Torah and to be able to rebut any wacko statement of wearing pink and robbing banks, because the Torah says we shouldn't. And that's the bargain. We do as God says, and we make sure that we each do it because we all have been given a copy of the cheat sheet together.
The kings of Israel were supposed to write the law with their very hand.
Yes, they were.
They were subject to it.
Absolutely.
And that's one of the things that dictators hate. They don't want to be subject to God.
No, they don't. And unfortunately, most of the kings of Israel weren't very good at that. But you're absolutely right that that was what was supposed to happen, was that the kings were supposed to recognize that they were subject to God, that they were not above God. They were not appointed by God to be above the law. They were appointed by God to be the ultimate enforcer of the law, to make sure the society would be just as possible. And most of the kings of our past did a terrible job of that. And partly that was because idolatry remained as a constant source of temptation, because it provides this illusion, and in the case of a government, this very real sense of control. And that's why we have a blessing for when we visit a place that doesn't have idolatry anymore. But one question first before we get to that.
Is it an offshoot of that our elected leaders need to put their hand on the Bible when they accept the oath of office?
No. The hand on the Bible was meant to be a way of trying to guarantee that they meant this promise honestly. Not anything else they might have promised during the campaign, we wouldn't hold them to. But this thing, when they say uphold the Constitution and all of that, we're believing that when they swear by God's name, that time they really mean it. Which is why many people of many faiths are quite opposed to the idea, because you should always mean everything you say. It shouldn't be, oh no, this time I really mean it.
Should be conditional. Right.
It should always be. It's like, so what? If you don't have your hand on the Bible during a press conference, you might be lying? Your fingers crossed behind your back? Exactly. So there are many people of many different faiths who are unhappy with the whole notion of putting a hand on the Bible. You know, if you want to say, so help me God, fine. But the hand on the Bible, this looks too much like, this time I mean it. Which may or may not be true, depending upon the politician. But we have, like I said, we have this blessing for when we come to a place that idolatry is uprooted. Now, for many of us, this would probably seem like one of the statements of intolerance within Judaism, of how can we be happy when we visit a place where there is a toppled idolatrous shrine or statue? I mean, isn't that not being properly tolerant of different faiths and different traditions? But when you hopefully now realize what idolatry means in the eyes of Judaism, that it's not just about someone choosing to worship the statue, but it's about a means of alienating a person from God and subjugating people to the control of others, then hopefully we all can realize that the uprooting of idolatry in that form is a very good thing for humanity. And so the blessing that's been traditionally recited,
Blessed is he who uprooted idolatry from our land. And as it has been uprooted from this place, so might it be uprooted from all places belonging to Israel, and turn the heart of those that serve them to serve you.
because that's what it's about. We don't say, thank you, God, for killing the idolaters. We say, thank you, God, for uprooting idolatry so that people can be free. And the ultimate expression of that freedom is a connection to God. That's unfettered by all of this muck that's been thrown onto it over the years, and by all of the dictatorial behavior of so many different successive cultures that have sought to use religion, and particularly idolatry, to control the minds and bodies of so many millions and millions of people. So the less idolatry, the better, and the less pseudo forms of idolatry that we allow, the better too. Take care. Keep studying. It's your only line of defense.